Hi, everybody. I'm here, and I'm going to take a few minutes, as usual, to share. But thank you for being here. Okay, please share, everyone. And help me out here. I know you do, and I thank you for that. Hello, everybody. I hope you're well tonight. Lana says she was in the middle of stuff and didn't get the announcement posted, but we'll share now. Thank you, Lana. Now is the important time to share. Deborah says, howdy, hi-ho. I see Russ is here. Nice to see you, Russ. Nice to see you, Jeff. And Karen, nice to see you as well. Thought I lost you. You went quiet while sharing. Yeah, I often go quiet while sharing. I figure the quicker I can do the sharing, the quicker I'll be back to speak to you. Okay, so here we are. We got to the edge of chapter 3 in Stephanie's book. Chapter 3 has been covered by quite a number of MMTers a few years back. It was the fashion to say that debt is not debt. This was one of favorite phrases of Michael Norman, who was saying debt is not debt. Bill Mitchell was saying something similar at the time. I think that Mike actually got it from Bill Mitchell's blog. I know that I did. That is the claim that debt, the national debt, isn't really debt. Let's begin to get into that. Now, if I'm lucky enough to find my cursor here, so I can get into anything. Oh, it's... Oh, there we go. Cursor finally unfroze. So let me begin to share. Share the screen with you. Sharing chapter 3. So you see the title of it is The National Debt That Isn't. And myth number 3, one way or another, we're all on the hook. And the reality is the national debt poses no financial burden whatsoever. And once I wrote a post on that, and the title of the post was something like, you don't owe $56,000, and we, as individuals, don't owe $56 trillion, or whatever the number was. I don't know, but that was the general title. Was intended to be a provocative title. And it was a provocative title, and a lot of people read that particular post. And it was popular for quite a while. But it deals in part with a similar kind of idea, or a related kind of idea. Anyway, Stephanie talks about when she arrived in Washington, D.C. in January of 2015, she was the only staffer on the Budget Committee in the Senate who looked at the world through the lens of a currency issuer. She knew the federal government wasn't like a household or private business. She knew Uncle Sam could never run out of money. She says, I knew that inflation rather than insolvency was the relevant punishment for overspending. And she says, I also knew I was alone in this thinking. Well, at least in Washington, she was. Of course, by then, she had taught a whole bunch of us, she along with the other MMTers, that, and so she at that time was no longer alone in this thinking, but she was just alone on the budget committee, a small world. Everyone else fell into one of two camps, the deficit hawks and the deficit doves. The hawks were the hardliners, mainly but not exclusively. The Republicans who looked at fiscal deficits as evidence of an epic mismanagement of our nation's finances. And she states the idea that budgets should balance, period. Any imbalance between spending and taxation ruffled their feathers. But only, of course, while the Democrats were in power, right? They didn't have that attitude when Bush was in power and he was tax cutting away and running up very large deficits. They didn't have that kind of attitude when Reagan was doing that. They only had that attitude when Democrats were in power, and they wanted to run some fiscal deficits. I mean, this has been a hypocrisy since the Democrats fell into the trap of trying to become the fiscally responsible party during the last half of the 1970s, during Jimmy Carter's time. It's weird how the parties traded places in this, okay, in American history. For years and years and years, it had been the Democrats who were willing to run deficits and to use Keynesian economics, and who didn't really worry too much about the deficits. And generally, they did very, very well, okay, in elections. I think it was Harry Hopkins who used to say, okay, the Democrats, we will tax and tax, spend and spend, okay, and elect and elect. That was an old saying. And generally, Harry Hopkins was right about that. That's what the New Deal was. That's what it did. But then the 1970s came around. Jimmy Carter thought he was being smart by trying to emphasize fiscal responsibility, how important it was to be fiscally responsible. And he thought he could use that against the Republicans, and he did in 1976. It worked for him in 1976, but didn't work for him in 1980 when people were suffering as a result of that kind of attitude. Anyway, getting back to Stephanie, she had coined the term deficit Al in 2010. Yeah, I remember when she did. I immediately wrote some posts about it as a way to distinguish the views held by the MMT economists from those of the more deficit-anxious birds. I decided the owl, she says, would make a good mascot for MMT because people associate owls with wisdom, and also because owls' ability to rotate their heads nearly 360 degrees would allow them to look at deficits from a different perspective. I think that was really a clever move she made, and it was very popular for a while to contrast the deficit owls of MMT versus the deficit hawks, okay, and the doves. I remember Jamie Galbraith had some fun with that, as well as myself, okay, and other MMTers. So most of the senators on the committee had never heard of MMT. Even the senator who hired me, Bernie Sanders, was initially surprised by the media attention surrounding his pick. When I met with the members of the committee for the first time, Virginia Senator Tim Kaine told me that he had read about my appointment in the Kansas City Star. No one was rude, but I can sense there was reticence about expanding the deficit aviary. It wasn't easy being the new bird in town, she says. I knew that my views differed sharply from theirs. The Democrats I was there to serve included a number of senators who had earned their reputations as fiscal conservatives. 3 of them had even anointed fiscal heroes by the notorious debt-shaming front group Fix the Debt. They were notorious. They were notorious. I wrote actually quite a bit about them in my 2 books on fiscal responsibility, which you can find on Kindle. That is Fiscal Responsibility, Volume 1, okay, and Volume 2. What Volume 1 was about was how the progressives were always giving up, to the debt mongers. And Volume 2 was about the activities, the continuous activities of the network, okay, of Peterson groups, and especially the Peterson Foundation. And the 2 volumes together are quite a few pages to go through, but worth it, I think, because they tell you a lot about what politics was like, okay, in Washington from 2009 to 2015. Anyway, Steph allows how the job was frustrating in a lot of ways. On fiscal matters, I didn't share the views of the members I was there to serve. I looked for ways to help the committee without reinforcing myths and understandings about our nation's finances. So Stephanie talks us through how she was oriented to try to get her message out and try to break down resistance that was built into the budget committee to hearing new thoughts. So she says, one of the most eye-opening things I learned came from a game I would play with members of the committees or their staffers. I think this is very clever. I did this dozens of times, and I always got the same incredible reaction. I'd start by asking them to imagine that they had discovered a magic wand with the power to eliminate the entire national debt with one flick of the wrist. Then I'd ask, would you wave the wand? Without hesitation, they all wanted the debt gone. After establishing an unflinching desire to wipe the slate clean, I'd ask a seemingly different question. Suppose that wand had the power to rid the world of U.S. treasuries. Would you wave it? Unquote. The question drew puzzled looks, furrowed brows, and pensive expressions. Eventually, everyone would decide against waving the wand. I found it fascinating. I find it pretty fascinating also. I didn't know that Stephanie was going through that experience. But now I understand a little better why, through that period of time, she did not emphasize minting the coin very heavily, because aside from the idea of getting them to accept that, if the coin was minted and the debt was gradually paid down over 30 years through a minting of the coin, then there would be no more treasuries anymore. Everybody would realize, okay, the treasury didn't have to go into debt, didn't have to sell any debt instruments. And they wanted those debt instruments. The Congress people wanted those debt instruments because their donors wanted the debt instruments because they all invested in the debt instruments. Steph says, I found it fascinating. These people served on a committee that was literally created to deal with issues that are related to the federal budget. And not one of them seemed to catch on to the trick. They all had a love-hate relationship with the national debt. They loved the U.S. treasuries as long as they thought of them as financial assets held by the private sector. But they hated the very same securities when they considered them obligations of the federal government. Unfortunately, you can't wave away the national debt without also eliminating the instrument that composes the national debt of the U.S. treasuries. They are one and the same. Is that right? Or should it be one and the same? Maybe that's a misprint. Or maybe Stephanie meant that in a crooked way. Anyway, eventually I'd point out that I had asked two versions of the same question. It was like asking folks if they preferred the weather when it's 77 degrees Fahrenheit or 25 degrees centigrade. That was sometimes awkward. Some of them told me they understood that waving the wand entailed eliminating the entire U.S. Treasury market, but they wanted the debt wiped out anyway because it scares voters. Now that is my position. That is why I was always a big advocate of the, as I originally posed it, the $60 trillion coin. I thought that would be enough to pay all the debt and cover the budget for 50 to 25 years. But Stephanie thought of the $100 trillion coin. And the reason why was that it was a better meme. She was right, of course. It is a better meme. And I quickly switched to the $100 trillion coin after she created that particular meme. Steph is really good at the memes. And as you can see from my going through this book, I'm putting things in plain language and stating them very, very clearly. And I think this last section we've been through is a particularly good one. It makes use of the idea how the shift in point of view makes people think about things completely differently. This is something that runs right through the book. So our next section says, it's so big. Trillions of dollars big. Of course, voters are terrified. How could they not be? Unless you manage to steer clear of all political discourse, it's virtually impossible to get through the work week without encountering some form of hysteria over fiscal deficits and the national debt. Newspaper headlines scream, of the record indebtedness and looming disaster. A debt clock towers over pedestrians on West 43rd Street in New York City, delivering the daunting numbers in real time. Actually, as those numbers get big, they should be having parties in the streets. But political cartoonists depict the federal debt as a hungry T-Rex eating its way through city streets, or as an ever-expanding balloon on the verge of exploding. Bookstores are replete with bombastic titles featuring anxiety-inspiring words like endgame, red ink, and fiscal therapy. Social media circulates breaking news alerts to report the latest dire projections from the CBO. And of course, Stephanie K. is right about all this. Okay, I'm not going to read it all, but she's quite right. The bottom line is how these folks are always saying the end is always near. You're beginning to hear that echo again from the Republican side. We got to get serious about the debt, folks. Now that we've done this bailout for the very rich people and their very rich corporations and the bank, and now that we've done the bailouts for our cronies, uh, the end is near. So we got to get responsible. We can't do any bailouts for the people. That would be irresponsible. But Stephanie says the truth is we're fine. Okay, the debt clock on West 43rd simply displays a historical record of how many dollars the federal government has added to people's dollars without subtracting, taxing them away. Those dollars are being saved in the form of U.S. treasuries. If you're lucky enough to own some, congratulations. They're part of your wealth. What others may refer to as a debt clock, it's really a U.S. dollar savings clock. But you won't hear that from anyone in Congress. That's where the title comes from. Our red ink is their black ink, or their black ink is our red ink, okay, whichever the title of this chapter is. Okay, or maybe that's going to be the next chapter. Okay, I forget. But you're getting the picture. It's a very funny kind of debt. Yes, it's a debt for the federal government, but it's savings for the non-government sector. Steph says, think about what would happen if a member of Congress returned to his or her district and tried to convince a room full of panicked constituents everything they deeply fear about our ballooning national debt is really a big nothing burger, with every other voice of authority delivering exactly the opposite message. The words of the soothsayer would go over like a lead balloon. Yeah, I know what that's about because I tried playing the soothsayer a few times and my words always went over like a lead balloon. Or they were just ignored. No, we got a problem. And we don't want to believe we don't have a problem. Sometimes, as Mark Twain put it, it's easy to fool people and to convince them that they have been fooled. Oh, yeah, they really resent it when you tell them they have been fooled. Even if their own thinking wasn't so broken. There are reasons why members of Congress might not want the rest of us to see the so-called debt for what it really is. Nothing more than those yellow interest-bearing dollars called U.S. Treasuries that we talked about in Chapter 1. So, MMTers have been debating for years on the blog at New Economic Perspectives what to call the Treasury. And one, J.D. Alt, is still particularly debating the issue, suggesting different things to different names to call the treasuries. I think what Stephanie does here, in other words, making a distinction between the green dollars, the non-interest bearing dollars, and the yellow interest-bearing dollars called U.S. Treasuries, I think maybe that's really a good way to look at it. The interest-bearing dollars and the non-interest-bearing dollars. I think J.D. Alt has something similar there as well. But it's not quite as graphic as the distinction between the green and the yellow. It's almost as good as the red and the black in Stendhal. For some politicians, attaching the word debt to a really big number creates the perfect foil. And then she refers to meganumophobia, the fear of large numbers. And says that might not be a medically recognized anxiety disorder, but plenty of politicians seem to think it's real enough. And they play on that fear, don't they? Play on that fear to try to stop people from thinking about what they're doing. Steph says, I remember being struck by this during a meeting with members of the U.S. Senate Budget Committee. CBO has just released its 2015 to 25 budget outlook, and the senators were poring over the reports on the findings. I think it's pouring over, isn't it? P-O-R-I-N-G, rather than P-O-U-R-I-N-G. Or maybe they were pouring alcohol over the report's findings. I don't know. The CBO had projected that the fiscal deficit would stand at 1.1 trillion, and the gross federal debt would reach 27.3 trillion in 2025. The committee's chair, Mike Enzi, found the number startling, but not startling enough. He was worried that by using decimal points instead of commas, the report would fail to stoke the right emotional response from our citizenry. To dramatize the numbers, he suggested CBO be required to write the numbers out in long form. 1 trillion 100 billion, and 27 trillion 300 billion. Recall that Senator Enzi ran a shoe sale business before getting involved in politics. As a businessman, he must have understood the importance of a good marketing campaign. So Stephanie goes on in this vein, how politicians like Senator Enzi are trying to make us anxious about the sheer size of this thing we label debt. By persuading voters that something must be done about these big, scary numbers, politicians can push for cuts to popular programs like Social Security and Medicare. Winning support from an agenda that calls for painful cuts requires sustaining public outrage over our national finances. These are programs that benefit enormous constituencies. People will fight tooth and nail to protect them. Unless, of course, they must be convinced there is no alternative, that we must act to fix the debt, quote unquote, before it's too late. MMT shows we don't need to fix the debt. We need to fix our thinking, not just to prevent senseless cuts to programs that support tens of millions of Americans, but also to have a more enlightened debate about the full range of things we could accomplish if we weren't so afraid. The debt isn't the reason we can't have nice things. Our broken thinking is. To fix our broken thinking, we need to overcome more than just an aversion to big numbers with the word debt attached. We need to beat back every destructive myth that hobbles our thinking. I think that last part was extremely well put and helps people to understand. The next section was entitled China, Greece, and Bernie Madoff. She harkens back to the bumper sticker that she talked about right at the beginning of the book in chapter 1, or maybe it was in the introduction. Okay, the woman who placed the bumper sticker of Uncle Sam on her SUV with his pockets turned out, all nervous about the national debt. Stephanie says, chances are she had other concerns, and maybe she had heard presidential candidate Obama complain that the U.S. was borrowing from China and driving up our national debt that we're going to have to pay off, quote unquote. Okay, the debt clock on West 43rd doesn't just provide a real-time record of the outstanding total. It also divides that total by the size of the U.S. population, calculating your share of the national debt. I think now, what is it, somewhere around 65,000 now, 67,000 per person. So maybe she was a mother who carried around a sense of guilt because she heard Wisconsin Congressman Paul Ryan saying, we need to deal with the debt to protect our children and grandchildren from a crushing burden of debt and taxes. Boy, when I read that kind of stuff from Paul Ryan, it got me totally incensed, okay, at the time. Totally and completely incensed. Okay, because, of course, there would be no crushing burden of debt and taxes for our children and grandchildren if Paul Ryan and others like him weren't so intent on trying to create obligations of a political nature on the part of our children and grandchildren with respect to repaying the debt through taxation. Talking about this as if it was inevitable and if it was our share of debt is just the trick they pull to get us to accept their idea that we ought to pay back the debt. Not him, but we, the rest of us, ought to pay back the debt through higher taxes or through cutting valuable programs for us. But that means nothing any longer to Paul Ryan. When he was young, he took advantage of some of those safety net programs. His father died, and he needed the Social Security support to help him work his way through college. He repaid the debt by becoming a Randian and deciding that people had no rights to their Social Security. Yeah, just as Ayn Rand did, as in the last years of her life, she was living on the Social Security dole. Well, perhaps this lady was thinking about our nation going broke. We all know what happened to Greece. Maybe she feared for our great nation. And the she here, of course, is the woman with the bumper sticker on her car. After all, Obama had described the national debt as irresponsible and unpatriotic. He must have been thinking of himself. I'm a mother and a patriot, and none of these things worry me. That's because I'm also an MMT economist who looks at all this through a fundamentally different lens. I can read the latest CBO report and not panic over the projected increase in the national debt. I don't agonize over my share of the national debt. And I never worry about the U.S. ending up like Greece. I don't fret over the possibility that China might one day shut off the spigot and starve the U.S. of the dollars we need to pay our bills. Heck, I don't even think we should be referring to the sale of U.S. treasuries as borrowing or labeling the securities themselves as the national debt. It just confuses the issue and causes people unnecessary grief. Even worse, the misguided fears stand in the way of better public policy, and that hurts all of us, so let's try to fix our thinking. It was in a campaign stop in Fargo, North Dakota. Obama told a small crowd that America was relying on a credit card from the Bank of China. And Stephanie talks about the power of the words because they tap into basic anxieties. We have a fear of actually relying on borrowed money to pay the bills. We know from our personal experience that taking on too much debt can cause financial distress. Borrowing to buy a home, a car, or even groceries puts you on the hook for future payments. And Stephanie goes through litany here. Hearing that our country is running up trillions of dollars in credit card debt is enough to make anyone worry. Learning that we owe that money to a foreign nation, an adversary even, only heightens the anxiety. It's not that we don't have anything to worry about when it comes to our international trading partners. As we'll discover later in Chapter 5, which is the winning a trade chapter, there are legitimate reasons for concerns, but relying on China to pay our bills isn't one of them. See why? Let's take a step back and think about how China ended up holding U.S. government bonds in the first place. Where did China get the $1.11 trillion in U.S. treasuries it held as of May 2019? Did Uncle Sam travel to Beijing, Star-Spangled Hat in hand, to ask the Chinese government for a loan? Not at all. What happens first is China decides it wants to sell some of what it produces to buyers outside of China, including the U.S. So Stephanie, in this part, explains the process of trade and how when we have deficits in trade or in the current account, actually, which is the count in which trade, is measured, that it's possible for the U.S. to build up a substantial debt. And so China gets all these dollars. So the question is, what is it supposed to do with these dollars? And Stephanie explains that here. She explains that China has the option to sit on those dollars or use them to buy something else. It's all very simply written, all very logical. If I had anything to complain about at all, it would be that her paragraphs might be a bit too long. It might be better for the flow of the reading, if there was more paragraphing when new thoughts, are introduced. It does this by purchasing U.S. treasuries. Borrowing from China involves nothing more than an accounting adjustment, whereby the Federal Reserve subtracts numbers from China's reserve account and adds numbers to its securities account, which is its savings account. The savings account is an account of those yellow interest-bearing dollars in treasuries, we've been talking about. Still just sitting on its U.S. dollars, but now China is holding yellow dollars instead of green dollars. To pay back China, the Fed simply reverses the accounting entries, marking down the number in China's securities account and marking up the number in its reserve account. In other words, its account with the green dollars in it. It's all accomplished using nothing more than a keyboard at the New York Federal Reserve Bank. So these dollars aren't in China. They're at the New York Federal Reserve Bank, and there are the yellow dollars or green dollars. You see how simply she has put it, how easy it is for people to understand. What Obama was missing is the fact, that dollars don't originate from China. I wonder if Obama ever did understand that the dollars don't come from China, that they're coming from the United States, or whether he went through his whole presidency without really realizing that. Doesn't it make you wonder? Steph says, we're not really borrowing from China so much as we're supplying China with dollars and then allowing those dollars to be transformed into U.S. Treasury security. The problem really is with the words we use to describe what's actually happening. There is no national credit card, and terms like borrowing are misleading. So is labeling those securities a national debt. There is no real debt obligation. As Warren Mosler likes to put it, quote, the only thing we owe China is a bank statement, unquote. So you could argue this is actually a bad deal for China and other countries that run trade surpluses against the United States. In fact, I think Warren did argue that in his book. After all, it means their workers are using their time and energy to produce real goods and services that China doesn't hold on to for its own people. By running trade surpluses, China is essentially allowing the U.S. to take its stuff in exchange for an accounting entry that says we're keeping track of how much of its output we took. But as we'll see in Chapter 5, China benefits from trade with the United States in a number of ways. So, Stephanie goes on explaining the situation with China, and trade. She points out that China can't avoid holding dollar assets without wiping out its trade surplus with the United States. And she points out China wants to continue to have a trade surplus with the United States because our dollars drive the Chinese economy. Now, at some point, that China will notice that its people have enough money to take over more of the productive capacity of their own country. And then China may not export as much, and its appetite for dollars may become less. As financial commentator and former investment banker Edward Harrison put it, the only question for China is which dollar assets, green dollars or yellow dollars, it will buy, not whether it will go on a U.S. dollar strike. That's right. I've said something similar in a blog or two of my own on this issue. And even if it does decide to hold fewer U.S. treasuries, yellow dollars, in its portfolios, this situation won't leave Uncle Sam strapped for cash. Remember, the U.S. is a currency issuer, which means it can never run out of dollars. And moreover, as Mark Chandler, popular television commentator and author of the book Making Sense of the Dollar, observed, China reduced its holdings of U.S. treasuries by 15% through June of 2016 through November of 2016. And the 10-year treasury yield was virtually unchanged. Even though it can't happen to the United States, it's possible for a country to lose access to affordable financing. Right, it can't happen to us because we're a monetary sovereign, but it happened to Greece. Why? Because they undermined their monetary sovereignty by abandoning the drachma in favor of the euro of 2001. So Stephanie then goes into Greece and the crisis there. And the Greek government no longer had a national central bank because it converted over to the euro that could act on its behalf by clearing all of its payments. The government really did need to find the money ahead of time if it wanted to spend. So the TABS model, which was discussed by Stephanie in Chapter 1, the TABS model applied to Greece because Greece was no longer a currency issuing government. But for currency issuing governments, it's the STAB model that applies, Stephanie's STAB model. But it does apply to a country like Greece, which turned itself into a currency user when it severed the link between the Greek central bank and the parliament in Greece. That's a mistake. To sever the link between your parliament and your central bank is to undermine your democracy. That's just what Greece did. It's just what France did. It's just what Germany did. It's just what was done by Belgium, and the Netherlands. All the countries that have become a part of the Eurozone. They've undermined substantially their democracy. They haven't all suffered equally in consequence of this. Germans have gotten along pretty well. they've done better than other nations, okay, for a variety of reasons. But Ireland suffered, Greece suffered, Portugal suffered, Spain suffered. All of those nations to the European South suffered grievously, or I should say grievously. And France hasn't done very well, too. They really did a stupid thing, severing the connection between their parliament, okay, and their currency. Stephanie talks about the rise in the interest rates for Greek bonds, 6% to 35%. Wow. But there are some people here in America who understands that we are not like Greece. For example, Warren Buffett, a billionaire investor and CEO of Berkshire Hathaway, knew better. Okay, then the question is, why didn't he say something to his friend Barack Obama? Well, maybe he did. Maybe Obama just never repeated it to us. Warren Buffett said, though, we can't have a debt crisis of any kind as long as we keep issuing our own notes and our own currency. So, and then the question of limits is raised. Alan Greenspan appeared on NBC's Meet the Press with Scott Pelley, I believe. And, well, maybe that wasn't with Scott Pelley. It might have been with Tim Russell at that time. Anyway, he said there was zero probability of default when it comes to U.S. Treasury. And he distinguished between voluntary and involuntary default. He pointed out Congress could do something stupid like refusing to raise the debt ceiling limit, which might trigger a voluntary default, but there is zero risk of the United States being forced into default by its creditors. That's because the federal government can always meet its obligation to turn those yellow dollars back into green dollars. I want you to notice how good that setting of the stage with the green dollars, okay, and the green dollars, okay, and the yellow dollars, how good that setting of the stage was for what Stephanie wants to say in this chapter. This is all very carefully interwoven. She doesn't have to introduce any new concepts here to make this point. You understood how easy it is, okay, for the U.S. to turn the yellow dollars back into green dollars. That is just about changing the relevant numbers on the balance sheet of the Fed. So you can't run out of other people's money. Why not? Because it's all our money. It's all either yellow dollars or green dollars. That's the only money we traffic in. That's it. Steph says, remember Thatcher had it backward. Her model treated the British government like a household that had no alternative but to collect taxes or borrow other people's money to pay the bills. MNT flips this around, showing the more appropriate real-world sequencing is STAB. The government spends first, making dollars available to pay taxes. And she goes through stab again here. When the government issues an equivalent amount of security, that is borrowing, quote, unquote. But the important point is that the $10 that is needed to buy the bonds has been supplied by the government's own deficit spending previously, because the government spent first. In that sense, the currency issuer's spending is self-financing. It's not selling bonds because it needs the dollars. Bond sales just allow holders of reserve bond balances, the green dollars, to trade them in for U.S. Treasuries, the yellow dollars. It's done to support interest rates, not to fund the government. Makers had not yet had the benefit of seeing MMT's insights. They view debt service as a growing financial burden on the federal government. That's a mistake. In truth, paying interest on government bonds is no more difficult than processing any other payments. To pay the interest, the Federal Reserve simply credits the appropriate bank account. Right now, Congress looks at the federal budget as a zero-sum game. Lawmakers look at rising interest expenditure the way we might look at a rising cable bill. It means less money to spend on everything else. So when the U.S. says the federal government is on track to spend more on interest payments than the entire discretionary budget, which includes defense and all domestic programs by 2046, many lawmakers begin to panic. They think it shrinks the amount of money that's left over, forcing them to spend less on other priorities. That's just not true. The congressional budget is limited only by Congress. To avoid cutting back on programs people value, Congress can simply authorize a larger budget. I wouldn't have said authorize there. Yes, it does have to authorize at some part of the process, but if it has two separate bills, it will authorize a larger budget to fund, its other priorities, and then it will appropriate the funds. It has to appropriate the funds. It's not enough just to authorize them. There are two stages, of the Congress obligating the executive branch to spend. Two stages in its mandating of the executive branch to spend, which then creates money in the private economy. Steph, I noticed this in a number of her works, tends to gloss over the distinction between authorization and appropriation. Which is simply a distinction that, as a political scientist, is important to me, because I learned that there were these two stages, authorization, and appropriation. Now, these days, of course, they may be telescoped into a single bill, both an authorization and an appropriations bill. They're not always distinct, but there still are instances where the two bills are distinct, and the authorization does not produce the mandate to spend. Steph says there's no fixed pot of money. There is, however, only so much room in the economy to safely absorb higher spending. That's the constraint that Congress needs to worry about, the inflation constraint, yes. The limit, as we saw in Chapter 2, is our economy's capacity to absorb that additional spending without pushing inflation higher. If a high percentage of interest income is spent back into the economy, could potentially push aggregate spending above potential, fueling some inflationary pressure. Though as Vice President Joe Biden's former chief economist, Jared Bernstein, and by the way, one of his chief advisors now during the campaign, Jared Bernstein notes, it seems unlikely that the government's interest payments no fuel overheating anytime soon, in part because about 40% of our public debt is now held by foreigners, which means an increasing share of interest payments is now leaking out of the country. Even if bondholders aren't spending enough of their interest income to fuel ordinary price inflation like the CPI, they might still fuel asset price inflation by using their interest income to bid up the prices of commodities, real estate, stocks, and so on. There is the potential for inflation, and there are distributional implications involved. But paying interest on government securities poses no financial challenge for the federal government. Some people complain the government shouldn't be paying interest at all. They see treasuries as a kind of luxury good only available to people who already have a lot of money. I confess to something of this attitude myself by turning their green dollars into yellow dollars so they can earn a little bit more. Government ends up adding to their riches over time, potentially widening the gap between those at the bottom and those at the top of the income distribution. That's one way to look at it. Of course, treasuries are also safe assets that help to diversify risk, so they provide a layer of protection to many working people who have pensions or other kinds of retirement plans that invest some of their money into government bonds. Distributional issues aside, Uncle Sam can always handle the interest payments. Quite true. And the next section, we could pay it off tomorrow. In April 2016, Time magazine devoted its cover to the U.S. national debt. Dear reader, you owe $42,998. So the article I wrote was, you don't owe $53,000 or whatever figure I gave at the time that I wrote it. That's what every American man, woman, and child would need to pay to erase the 13.9 trillion U.S. debt. Stephanie says, I don't know about you, but I don't have 43,000 lying around. I don't either, and I'm not about to give it to a government. I mean, it's the government who obligated itself to pay the 43,000 per person by selling the yellow dollars. It didn't have to send those particular yellow dollars. I'm not responsible for it selling the yellow dollars, and I did not contract to pay those yellow dollars back. The U.S. government did. And since the U.S. government has the power of the purse and the power to simply create that $43,000 per person, it can damn well pay back what it promised to pay back without bothering me or you or any other individual in the United States who doesn't want to be bothered. Steph says, I'm also not squirreling away money in anticipation of one day being asked to write Uncle Sam a big fat check for my share of the national debt. It's never going to happen. The idea the rest of us are personally liable for some portion of the national debt is preposterous. Yes, it is. It's an extension of the household budgeting philosophy that wrongly assumes the government must ultimately depend on us, the taxpayer, to pay its bills. Even Donald Trump knows better than that. But evidently Barack Obama doesn't, right? That's not how most economists see it. Some will argue that faster growth would help us deal with our debt problem because it's the ratio of debt relative to the size of our economy that really matters. In the numerator, the debt is rising, but the ratio will fall if the denominator grows faster than the debt. Yeah, that was really ridiculous, too. And the trick then is to keep the debt ratio from heading northward in perpetuity. At some point, it must come down, or the debt path is considered mathematically unsustainable. So for decades, we worried about that. Oh, the debt trajectory, the ratio is rising steadily. It's a terrible problem. And there are many of them, as Steph says, now telling us it might be sustainable after all. But for the MMT economist, as Steph said, uh, there's really no problem with that. Uh, Even someone as liberal, okay, as Blanchard, okay, Olivier Blanchard, world-renowned economist and former head of the IMF, uh, this is his thinking. He says he expects the interest on the debt R to remain below the economy's growth rate G, a condition R less than G that ensures the debt ratio will not head off to infinity. If he's right, then his model predicts, okay, the U.S. will not experience a debt crisis anytime soon. But he doesn't dismiss the possibility of future debt crisis. Well, how can we dismiss it? Well, it's easy, as Stephanie shows us here. Stephanie quotes Scott a full while here, who looked at this question of debt sustainability from an MMT point of view 15 years before Blanchard. But also Scott recognized that a government that borrows in its own sovereign currency can always maintain the critical condition for sustainability R less than G. That is, it never has to accept a market rate of interest, because for the MMT, the central bank can always control the interest rate. The interest rate is a policy variable. It's not set by the private markets or in the private markets. The Blanchard take on sustainability rests on the possibility interest rates could eventually jump higher, leading to the kind of debt crisis that unfolded in Greece or Argentina. But the U.S. is a sovereign currency. It's not like Greece or Argentina. Greece borrows in euros. Argentina borrowed in U.S. dollar-denominated debt and defaulted on it. But the U.S. can't lose control, okay, of its interest rate, because the Federal Reserve can set it at whatever its target is. So the Federal Reserve can always set the interest rate as less than the rate of growth, okay, of GDP. And so therefore, there is no possibility of losing control. But even that is not the full story, because none of this takes into account the possibility that for a currency issue, whatever we owe, we can pay off whenever we want to pay it off. Now, it probably wouldn't be good to pay it off all at once. If we took what do we owe now? 23 trillion in debt. To pay the 23 trillion off tomorrow, to buy it in the open market, in other words, all the debt, and pay for it, we could do it. I mean, we could do it with, if we paid enough in reserves for that debt, if we paid a price higher than the principal, we could probably buy all the debt now and have zero debt within a week, let's say, something like that. But if we did that, we would flood the banking system with green dollars, with our reserves. And people would be wanting a lot of the yellow dollars. They probably won't even want to sell all of the yellow dollars. But if they had all the green dollars available and they decided to go on a spending spree, that could be highly inflationary. On the other hand, if the debt were gradually paid off as it falls due over 30 years, then it's just a straight up trading of yellow dollars for green dollars when the economy can handle the green dollars coming back into it. That's the way it would work out. That's why it would work out extremely well. And Stephanie goes through an account here of how during the war, the central bank just managed the interest rate on behalf of what Treasury wanted to pay, and that this coordination of policy officially ended in 1951 with an agreement known as the Treasury Federal Reserve Accord, which freed the Fed to pursue an independent monetary policy. The Treasury Fed Accord is not a law. It's just an agreement between two agencies of the federal government. The Treasury could still coordinate with the president, but to force the Fed to basically act in line with what Treasury wanted it to do, just as it did during the Second World War. This could be done right now during the COVID crisis if the president wanted it that way. Anyway, okay, all this is very well written and very well put by Stephanie. And I think it brings the reality of the financial situation home to people who do not understand it and who want to understand it in a simple language. So I think that this chapter is a great piece, okay, of writing. Stephanie argues in this that we could pay off the national debt tomorrow if we wanted to do it, that Japan could do that too. And she argues in this that if we bought back the bonds, it wouldn't have an immediate effect on net wealth, but it would have an effect, okay, on income, because the bonds are interest-bearing instruments and the cash is not. When the Bank of Japan, she's talking about here, replaces bonds with cash, the private sector loses out on any interest that would have been paid in the future. This is true. So she says retiring the debt siphons interest income out of the private sector over a period of time. Yes, it absolutely does. So, okay, so the discussion here says, well, even if we paid it off tomorrow, it wouldn't be necessarily inflationary, because why would people rush out and buy things when their interest income has fallen? Their wealth is unchanged and they're used to falling prices. And the short answer is they wouldn't. I think that's a little too glib an answer, because people, if they had been operating in a particular way for some time, and a lot of their wealth was tied up, and they had investment plans, but the wealth was tied up in treasury bonds, quite a lot of it. and there was pressure to hang on to the income stream from the income. I don't know. People balance these two things off. We don't know how it would work out. But right now, people who hold our yellow currency cannot trade the yellow currency for the green currency simply on a demand basis. Now, it's true we can accommodate all their needs when it comes to the green currency. A run on green currency is not going to hurt us as a run on gold would have. Okay, when we were on the gold standard, we can produce the green currency. So that's not a problem. The question is, having all the Greek currency out there, what does that do when it all happens at a particular point in time? I don't know, but I don't know if I'm ready to say that, as Stephanie has said here, that they would not. Because people are not always rational. Anyway, I think in a rational world, it probably is true that if transferring all the outstanding government debt onto the central bank's balance sheet if their interest income had fallen. Stephanie said, I would think twice about stripping the private sector of all of its interest-bearing government income. I think that's probably good advice, but if we didn't have to strip it of all of the interest-bearing income because the Federal Reserve took over the function of defending its own interest rates by directly controlling the interest that it was going to pay, and it issued the bonds, then, of course, there would be no legal debt that would be on the Treasury books, which is to say the government books. And therefore, the terrorists, the debt terrorists, would not be able to complain about the Treasury debt all the time. Steph then finishes, just think of it, no more government shutdown as lawmakers engage in theatrical uprisings over raising the debt limit. No one comparing Uncle Sam to a spendthrift who's running up the credit card and borrowing from China. No fear of losing access to the bond market and being forced into default like Greece. No economists arguing about whether interest rates will be low enough to keep the debt on a sustainable path. And best of all, no more stress about how to cover your share of the national debt. We could rip the bumper sticker right off. We actually did it once. It was 1835. Andrew Jackson was president. It was the only time in American history when the public debt was paid all the way down. That was long before the Federal Reserve was created, so the debt wasn't gobbled out of existence by the federal bank. Instead, it was eliminated the old-fashioned way, that is, by reversing fiscal deficits and paying off the bondholders. It didn't end so well. And she points out, of course, that the U.S. by 1835 was debt-free. It was also headed for one of the worst economic downturns the country has ever experienced. In hindsight, it seems obvious why things unfolded the way they did. It does. But, of course, what Stephanie was earlier discussing here is if we paid off the debt, all the debts, tomorrow by simply manufacturing the money, That would be a much different situation than 1835, because it won't have been preceded by a pay down of the national debt. I forget how many years it happened over, maybe 15 years, okay, at that time, or maybe 18 years. They gradually ran surpluses and reclaimed the money the government had issued into the economy by running surpluses. And that's why they got themselves into a depression. That is not something that would happen if the money simply were printed. So the outcome would probably be very different. And that's the chart of the correlation of the years when debt, okay, is paid down and years when the depression began. And there you see. Uh, Stephanie discusses Thayer's work. Dealing with the the correlation of our efforts to pay down the deficit, okay, and later depressions, okay, that we had. And she explains the problem with the surpluses is that currency users can't sustain the private sector deficits that correspond to government surpluses indefinitely. And that eventually the private sector reaches the point where it can't handle the debt, okay, it has accumulated. When that happens, spending grinds sharply lower and the economy falls into a depression. There was one other brief period of sustained fiscal surpluses under Bill Clinton, 1998-2001. Democrats still think that's a grand achievement of the Clinton administration. Everybody was celebrating. But then people began to rethink things, and they began to realize that they might have to get rid of all the treasuries. And so they thought they were going to have a problem. But in the end, the problem solved itself. And that is, we experienced a terrorist attack. By 2002, the surpluses were gone. The U.S. was no longer on track to pay down the national debt, much less retire the full amount. The federal government moved back into deficit after 2001, when the stock market bubble, which had been supporting consumer spending, burst. The recession began in 2001. It was fairly mild, but the damage has been done. Clinton surpluses weakened private sector balance sheets, magnifying the damage caused by the arrival of the Great Recession, which began in 2007. And Stephanie then takes us through that. She relates that again to the STAB model. And then she raises the question again, so why keep treasuries around? Should we love them or leave them? Is the national debt a national treasure, as Alexander Hamilton believed, or is it irresponsible and unpatriotic, as Obama described it? Should I still have some. Thanks. One thing is for sure, we don't want to start wiping out U.S. Treasuries the ugly way. Ah, boy, do I agree with that. We definitely don't want to start. We don't want to start to wipe them out the ugly way. I just did something I do not want to do. Here we go. Let me find out where I was again. Let's see where I am here. Okay. There we go. Sorry, I lost my place here. Trying to get a little too fancy. But we're almost done for tonight anyway. Here we are. We don't want to start wiping out U.S. Treasuries. The ugly way, the 1835 way, the Clinton way, by building fiscal services on the back of unsustainable private sector deficits. By the way, that was really good. The 1835 way, the Clinton way. If we really want to make the national debt disappear, there are more painless ways to go about it. The most straightforward option is to do it the way Lonergan described. Simply let the central bank buy up government bonds in exchange for bank reserves. A pain-free transaction that turns yellow dollars back into green dollars. I think that is a really good idea. It can be carried out using nothing more than a keyboard at the Federal Reserve. One other option would be to phase out the issuance of treasuries over time. Instead of selling bonds to drain off the reserve balances that result from Treasury spending, we could simply leave the reserves in the system. We can do it without interfering with the Federal Reserve's ability to conduct its monetary policy because the Fed doesn't need government bonds to hit its short-term interest rate target. Over time, all the outstanding bonds will mature and the debt will gradually disappear. That, is my solution. But under overt congressional financing. There is another option. We could learn to live with them. There's nothing inherently dangerous about offering a safe, interest-bearing way for people to hold on to dollars. If we choose to live with them, we should come to grips with the fact. The thing we call the national debt is nothing more than a footprint from the past. It tells us where we've been, not where we're going. Records the history of the many deficits that have been run since the birth of our government in 1789. The bloody world of wars, many recessions, and the decisions taken by thousands of people elected to Congress over the years. What matters is not the size of the debt or who holds it, but whether we can look back with pride, knowing that our stockpile of treasuries exists because of the many, mostly positive interventions that were taken on behalf of our democracy. If we're not going to eliminate treasuries, we must find a way to make peace with the national debt. Perhaps we should start by giving it another name. The national debt is nothing like a household debt. So using the word debt just leads to confusion and unnecessary angst. We could just refer to it as part of our net money supply. I doubt, but yellow dollars will catch on. But hey, it's worth a shot. I think it's worth a shot. In Shakespeare's but hey, it's worth a shot, but Juliet famously inquired, in Romeo and Juliet, but what's in a name, quote unquote. She wasn't troubled when she learned, that Romeo was a Montague. For her, a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, quote unquote. Love, as they say, is blind. On the political stage, words matter. It's time to come up with a new name for these interest-bearing dollars. I think yellow dollars is a good name. Specifically, yellow interest-bearing dollars, as opposed to green zero interest dollars. That's not bad. I like that. I thought that chapter was really brilliantly done. I guess that's all we'll get through for today. It's only chapter 3. We're moving on to chapter 4 now. I hope you liked that chapter, because I thought all the various themes in it were very skillfully interwoven and put in very plain language and gives people a lot to think about. I mean, I've been thinking about a lot of the issues raised in this chapter myself and doing pretty deep thinking about it, I think, compared to a lot of people. But there are some things I hadn't thought of in this particular chapter and that were explained very, very well by Stephanie. I'm really loving this book thus far. Next chapter is chapter 4. Their red ink is our black ink. I would love to speed up the process here somewhat, because even though I love this, I'm not sure that you love it quite as much. And I think we ought to be able to accelerate. I'm going to try my best on Saturday to go through chapters 4 to 6. Chapter 4 is a tough one. That's the one on sectoral balances. But if I can possibly do it, I'll try to get through chapters 4, 5, and 6 for you on Saturday night. when I come back. In the meantime, I am going to turn now, as always, to your comments. Okay, comments. Here we go. Hey, Avro. Hi, Joe. He says, hi, Avro. Avro says, hi, Thelma. Avro says, wow, what a great point about number anxiety by Dr. Kelton. Yeah, I think that was a really good point. Avro says, very damaging by Obama. Kay says, Avro Obama, another corporate show. He is. Well, as long as I owe them, meaning my portion of the national debt, they'll never be broke. For us to accept our own austerity, unquestionably. What a what a diabolical plot, right, Avro? Avro says, I hear Morgan Freeman's voice saying, she's right, you know. Who's right? You mean Ayn Rand? Nah. Ayn Rand was full of shit. Sandy Degg said shared. And she greeted everyone. I said, I'm guilty of that too. Run-on sentences is my middle name. No, I don't think Stephanie had any run-on sentences. What I was just saying was her paragraphs could have been broken up. I thought in a number of instances that they were too long and that points could have been emphasized better and punctuated better if the paragraphs had been shorter than they were in many instances. But in part, okay, that's a matter of taste. I'm not going to quibble about that. This is one great book. And Russ says, yes, I wonder big time whether Obama ever got it. That dollars do not come from China. Should we write him an open letter and ask him whether he ever realized that that U.S. dollars don't come from China? Karen said, I can't wait to get my book. Well, the way I got it was through Kindle. Okay, I waited for over a year. I ordered it over a year ago. Avro said he didn't mind borrowing those dollars from China for the biggest transfer of wealth to the rich, did he? No, he didn't. Avro says, now I want some stuffed grape leaves. Stuffed grape leaves. Oh, so does that mean you're out of the hospital, Avro? Well, Carmen? How come the UK didn't fall for the EU? Well, the UK was very cautious about getting rid of the pound, you know. The pound was, such an important financial currency in the world that it magnified the influence of the UK beyond that which was justified by its population and its previous historical role. In Western finances, the City of London is still enormously powerful and its power is based on the pound. Excellent visual aid by Stephanie using the color coding. Yeah, I think that was good to use color coding. What's the difference between appropriation and allocation when it comes to funding? Just a ponderous moment, okay, on my behalf. Well, it's just two stages, okay, in the process. Congress takes two bites of the apple. In other words, it authorizes the programs, okay, in other words, it authorizes things that the federal government is to do, but then it has to appropriate the money for those things that it wants the federal government to do. The appropriation of money occurs in the appropriations bills, not in the authorization bills. So if Congress passes an authorization bill, but never gets around to appropriating money, then the executive branch can't spend the money. So that's what's going on there. Joanne says, having phone issues, I'll watch later. I said, oh, I thought they still use pounds. Crikey, now I'm even more confused. Yeah, they didn't want to give up the pound. Yeah, the UK still uses pounds. They don't use euros. They still adhere to the pound. It's the pound that's important for the remnants of the British Empire, the financially important currency for the remnants, okay, of the empire, not the euro. No, pounds are not the same as euros. No, I think what we were referring to was the difference between the authorization bills and the appropriations bills, okay, in Congress. I don't think the word allocate is a legal word, okay, in the lexicon of Congress. The legal words are to authorize spending and to appropriate spending. Those are the words that have the legal status. And by the way, one of the problems with, but don't think of it as debt, is that the Treasury issues what are legally called the debt instruments. So in order to change the thinking, to some degree, we'll have to change also the legal terminology. Merrill says, okay, thanks, my apologies. Kay says, being a part of the EU makes it easy for immigrants to come in and work for lower wages than the UK unions did. Sure. Sure, that's why they were interested in it, but they never really wanted to switch the currency. Avril says, sounds just like a neoliberalism. Yeah. Brexit is an abbreviation for British exit. It is. Exactly, Sandy. Yeah, I think that this book could be incorporated into advanced high school classes, even certainly into introductory college classes easily. Yes, there is a definitive MMT text by it's by Bill Mitchell, L. Randall Ray, and Martin Watts. And the name of it, is Macroeconomics. And that is an MMT textbook. And there's also another book which can be considered something of a text, and it is Randy Ray's, his book, the title of which is is Modern Money Theory. That's an excellent book. I have read it a number of times, and it is an excellent book. Abel says, "Oh, pray tell, I just didn't hear about it." And Rahul Majumdar says, "Who remembers believing that the Clinton surpluses were a good thing?" I don't know if I ever thought they were a good thing. They seemed like an accomplishment at the time. In other words, done through skillful use of the management of spending, of government spending, and budgeting. I never thought that they were necessarily good for the economy, because even then, before I learned, of MMT, I was very skeptical about the idea that deficits were bad and surpluses were good. And I was focused on the things which the Clinton administration was failing to do. And Sandy said, "I thought that Randall Ray had something to do with it." Yeah, Randy did. And it's actually, the title of the book is actually The Deficit Myth, not the death myth. Yes, it came out on June 9th, and that's what we are reviewing here. We have reviewed now the first 3 chapters. Rahul Majumdar says, yeah, Mitchell, Ray, and Watts, available online. Yes. And Avil says, "I remember," said the member Berries from South Park. That's it. Thanks, Rahul. What do you mean by wiping the treasuries out the ugly way? Stephanie meant, and I agree with her, that the way you wipe them out in the ugly way is to pay the debts back by running surpluses. That is the ugly way. And the reason why it's the ugly way is because it causes depressions. That is the ugly way. Rahul says it's a very introspective chapter. Says it's starting to make sense even to me. Rahul says public debt equals private savings. He doesn't quite say that. Actually, it's government debt is equal to non-government savings, as we will see in chapter 4, as we get into chapter 4. And that's the red ink and Black Ink chapter. Avromano says, I'll be out dancing, getting drunk Saturday night. Just kidding. Avril says, no, Stephanie K is right, She's right about what? Kay says, Avril, I wish. Laugh out loud. Let's go dancing. Yes, write the letter. China needs a USD to buy Trump's meat. Sandy says Trump meat would be rancid. Rahul Majumdar says it would if you wanted an economically literate citizenry. The plutocrats don't want that, of course. Ivel says, yes, I'm back in Miami, but my mind coordination and balance is still shaky. But I fought that neoliberal patient dumping hospital for almost 3 weeks, plus the physical therapist was in my corner. I did good considering that I don't have health insurance. Russell says Trump's meat is tiny. God. Avril says dead instruments, is that also leftover jargon from gold standard days? Yeah, that's the historical term. Okay, it's the legal term. In other words, the limit, okay, on the national debt. In other words, you've heard about the debt limit, okay, or the debt ceiling. Okay, the debt limit, okay, is the limit of the principal, okay, of all outstanding debt instruments. Outstanding debt instruments are those that have not been paid off. Yes, it's leftover jargon. Russ says, after you finish the deficit myth, you do a couple of shows on Ballinger's 1,000 Castaways. Okay, I'll check that out. Romano says, especially that pork. Kay says, her book came out on my birthday. Is that a sign? Yes, it is. It's a good sign. And John DeClef Pinheiro says, watch MMT Explained by Stephanie Kelton on CNBC. I have seen that video. It's a very nice video. It's a very nice video, but this book, okay, is better. Far, far better. Okay, I am through it all. I am tired. I got up at 6 o'clock this morning in order to talk to a doctor or talk to an advice nurse, who then made me an appointment to talk to a doctor, okay, at 8:10. So I got 3 hours of sleep just sliced away out of my night, out of what I hoped would be a good night's sleep. I did catch up a little bit, but not nearly enough. Anyway, good night, all. Thank you for coming. Yeah, reading works better for me too, because I can read over and over and over again. I can watch videos over and over again too, but it doesn't work as well as seeing the words and cogitating over the words. getting the words. Okay. Don't forget my Patreon account, by the way. It's at patreon.com. /Joe_Firestone. Laura says thank you and good night. Yes, thank you and good night. And Rahul says thank you, Joe. And Russell says see you again soon. Thank you all for coming. And Nancy says thanks for tonight. Stay safe and healthy. I'm doing my best. Good night, all. See you Saturday.